How are you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
Good. Glad to have you here. I invited you to talk about the apple cider vinegar study and all the drama that was associated with that. But before we get to that, do you mind telling us a little more about yourself, your background, what are you busy with these days?
Yeah, sure. I'm Eric. Did my PhD in human movement science. All my research has been related to exercise physiology and sports nutrition mostly. I did a postdoc at Duke University in evolutionary anthropology, where I studied relationships between physical activity, energy expenditure, and health. And now I'm a member of the faculty here at Duke, where I teach a bunch of courses related to exercise and health. And of course, I still continue my research in Herman Pontzer's lab over in evolutionary anthropology, where our main line of research is just focusing on how human energy expenditure is regulated and what the extremes of energy expenditure actually look like.
Okay, that's cool. So, are you currently involved with any of the research related to the constrained energy expenditure model? If so, what exactly are you doing? Like, what are some specific areas that you're conducting research right now?
So I am a research scholar in the lab, and I am the person who operates the laser analyzer for all of our doubly labeled water research. So if the Poncer lab is doing it and it has anything to do with energy expenditure, I'm involved. Yeah, we kind of constantly have a number of various studies going on that at least are partially related to the constrained energy expenditure model. Within the past year, we've had work going on in a study with ultra endurance athletes, seeing basically how high their energy expenditure seemed to be on an ongoing basis. We had research on actually pregnant marathon runners, which was really
Wow,
cool.
that's
So,
very
kind of a key
specific.
feature of our constrained energy hypothesis is that it doesn't seem like people are able to sustainably keep their energy expenditure higher than about 2.5 times their basal metabolic rate. And we see that functioning as a bit of a cap or a bit of a ceiling across various different populations. And pregnancy alone usually elevates that all the way up to like 2.2 in many cases. So, basically, there's a lot of, endurance athletes who end up pushing up around 2.3, 2.4, 2.5. So if pregnancy alone is pushing you to 2.3, and we see that a lot of marathon runners may be, getting a similar level of elevation, you would imagine that you put the two together and you're going to be well above that ceiling. And so I don't think we've published that data in paper form yet, but the last I heard an update from the doc student who was doing that work, the preliminary results were being shared at a conference, and that upper limit seemed to hold pretty well. So it's been
Wow.
now a number of studies where the challenge is out there. If you think that you can maintain energy expenditure more than 2.5 times your basal metabolic rate for more than a year in a row, uh, not only do we would we be interested to see it? We encourage it. We our approach to the model is let's try to break it, and so far we haven't been able to.
Okay, that's cool. So I think a general, like a key theme, like a word that you keep repeating here is maintain, right? To maintain
Correct.
that level of energy. So you're not saying that you can't go out and do like, I don't know, triple, quadruple your basal metabolic rate in 1 day or 2 days, or I don't know, maybe you're doing a race, maybe you're doing an ultra marathon. So is it true that you could maintain like a higher energy expenditure above that 2.5 limit for that period, but then you would go back? What happens? Like, is that possible?
Absolutely. Yeah, and there's zero question that you can exceed that cap in the short term. So there's a great paper by Thurber and colleagues published in 2019 where we basically I wasn't involved at that time, but they published a logarithmic curve, which is basically energy or what we call metabolic scope. So basically, how many times your basal metabolic rate is your total energy expenditure. Like we say, a metabolic scope, we think there's kind of a cap at around 2.5 for long-term sustainable energy or metabolic scope. So there's this big curve where we basically say, listen, for a day, if you want to exercise at, 10 times your metabolic, your basal metabolic rate, we absolutely do see in very short-term events, 10x, basal metabolic rate. But as the duration of trying to sustain this energy expenditure gets longer and longer and longer, it kind of drops down and reaches this essentially a bit of an asymptote at what appears to be this kind of ceiling level of 2.5. So yeah, we basically are trying to look at, if someone can actually sustain a metabolic scope of 3 or 3.5, if someone could do that for 2 years straight, then the model would be would need serious revision at that point. But yeah, so far we haven't really observed that.
2 years is a long time. I remember
Yeah,
seeing, I don't remember the name, but there was this guy that made a documentary about it. He did like a full Ironman every day for, was it 100 days? Or I don't know if you're aware of that particular case. Yeah, I wonder
I
if,
haven't, no.
yeah, that would be a cool case study. And by the way, are you, just out of curiosity, are you, and your lab, are you still continuing your research on the Hadza?
I can't speak to everything the lab's involved with because I don't have full visibility into every, various collaboration that Herman might be involved with at the moment. I'm not personally doing any work with the Hadza. I know that this summer we did have some members of our lab who went out to northern Kenya and did some research with the Dawsonich community there. I know we currently have a collaboration going on in Nigeria. So we still do have some field work happening, various parts of the world on other continents. But I'm not familiar personally with any work with the Hadza community at this time.
Okay, yeah. Well, cool stuff. And like we went on a big tangent here, but while we're at it, did you get a chance? There was a study coming, like it came out, I think, a few days ago. It was like Howard 2025 physical activity is directly associated with total energy expenditure without evidence of constraint on compensation. Well, it looked like people are showing this study, throwing it around as a proof of invalidating the constrained energy model. Do you have any comments on that? Did you get a chance to read that study?
So I haven't read it in full detail. It just came out a couple days ago, and unfortunately, they still make me work every day. I got to teach and grade papers and do experiments, all that stuff. But no, I mean, whenever I see a paper or I hear about a paper indicating, that the constrained expenditure model is, broken or something, as you can kind of tell from what I've said so far, my first thing is, oh, did you find somebody who's maintaining consistent energy expenditure in the long term that seems to be above that kind of metabolic ceiling? At the end of the day, the main concept, especially if you look at more recent papers discussing the constrained model, there has to be a reason for constraint to be occurring, right? Which would either mean you're doing very extreme, very, very, very high levels of physical activity, or you're doing heightened physical activity in the context of dietary restriction. If this is an energy conservation tool, it really wouldn't make sense to say, like, if you go from being fairly sedentary to average physical activity level and you're eating plenty of calories, we would expect no reason that there would be a major energy constraint because there's no energy related pressures on trying to conserve energy there. So the first thing I did when I heard about that paper was I was like, cool, let's look at the figures and see if there's anybody who is really pushing that limit of 2.5 times basal metabolic rate in terms of their metabolic scope. And looking at this paper, it doesn't look like there's a single individual above 2.5. And there's if you look at the four highest values in terms of metabolic scope, oddly enough, they're like essentially lined up directly on 2.5, which is really, really fascinating. So, you know, I think one of the biggest challenges with doing work on the constrained energy expenditure model is that a lot it has a different meaning to a lot of different people in terms of how they interpret it. I think that our lab has been pretty transparent about where we expect to see meaningful constraint occurring. And what's interesting about this particular paper is, once again, we're not really seeing anybody who's exceeding what we to believe is what we believe to be kind of that upper threshold that essentially is where the major constraint is occurring. So, yeah, I'll definitely, I plan to dig into the paper in more detail eventually. But for now, that's always my biggest thing. If I open up a paper and someone says, yeah, this person was doing their normal day-to-day stuff, or this group of people, and we found people routinely exceeding 2.5, that's the kind of thing that would really pique my interest, and I'd be quite surprised by that. There's no level of expenditure relative to activity level that I'm seeing in this particular paper that I find to be considerably like incompatible with that model.
Okay, makes sense to me. Well, can't wait to read your more thorough review on that paper. Well, that's a solid track record of being involved in the research, and you're also involved in the field through coaching. But the reason I contacted you 2 years ago and the reason you're here is not because of your original research, but because of your involvement in a few projects for basically safeguarding the literature from questionable studies. So you were involved in a bunch of cases where you wrote a letter to the editor about a particular paper. In some cases, that has led to some retractions happening. And would you mind just reminding us about some of those maybe more notable retractions that has happened before so that maybe we get to know a little more about your track record in safeguarding the literature?
Yeah, I was loosely involved, kind of more behind the scenes on a whole saga that kind of unraveled with papers from a researcher of the last name Barbalio, who had published a lot of papers related to strength and conditioning type research, resistance training research. So there was kind of this whole big uh, white paper that was written, not looking at any one particular paper, but actually a whole grouping of papers where there were a lot of concerns about the integrity of the findings and the reliability or robustness of the findings. And from that particular saga, I can't even really remember. I know there were multiple retractions and at least one expression of concern that got published, but definitely it was the type of thing where a lot of there was a lot of fallout from identifying some of those, you know, really just questionable patterns in the data that raised a lot of questions about the veracity of the data. More recently, I've written a few letters to the editor. One of my things that I don't do it by choice, but I really like meta-analysis. I think it's a very useful tool. But in the realm of exercise and nutrition, I mean, there's no way to sugarcoat it. There's a lot of meta-analyses that get published with substantial errors. And so if I'm going to write a letter to the editor about something, in this case, errors in meta-analysis, I think I've published like 3 of these in the last year or two, and I'm actually working on a 4th at the moment. I don't just go through and nitpick and say, hey, you should have carried the one here, or you should have used this adjustment instead of that adjustment. So the pooled effect size, you calculated 0.26. I think it should be 0.23. I don't do that. Um, I go through and say, like, if I find a meta-analysis where the errors are so substantial that they fundamentally change the conclusion of the work, meaning that, this study concluded absolutely for sure the pooled effect is significant and it's not even close if you do it right, I write the letter. And then, of course, if the inverse is true, if they conclude this is a completely null effect, don't even think about this intervention, it's totally useless, and I fix the errors, you recalculate the analysis, and now it's significant and clinically meaningful, then you got to write the letter. My whole guiding principle for why I'm involved with research is I believe that scientific research is useful and worthwhile. And in order to maintain that worldview, it has to be valuable to correct errors in the literature. And it has to be important to do that. It seems very, very difficult to justify a perspective where you say science is useful and worth doing and worth using, but not worth correcting when it's wrong. I can't really wrap my head around that kind of perspective. So it is fundamentally, as we'll probably get into, a colossal I wouldn't say waste of time. It is a tremendously poor time investment to do that work of correcting the literature after unreliable findings are published. But at the end of the day, the literature is only worth, it's only useful to the point that it's robust and reliable. And so ultimately, those things do need to be weeded out, even if the incentive structures aren't in place to really make that a high return investment in terms of your time and energy.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm glad that you mentioned meta-analysis because it's really interesting for me because I come from a biomedical engineering perspective, and then I did another master's degree in exercise science kinesiology. And it was super interesting for me because when in our field, when we speak of meta-analysis, it's usually, combining a bunch of studies with thousands of participants each. And usually the thing they're doing is like a medicine therapy. It's something simple that is very similar across those different cohorts that you're combining. But then you come to the exercise science literature and you're combining a few studies, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 participants each. And it's quite interesting that they even have some, I'm going to say, significant methodological differences. Like the way
Yeah.
they have assessed the power, the strength, or the dose they use. Sometimes they're using an acute dose, sometimes they're using a chronic dose. So yeah, I'm glad that smart people like you are doing that work, and we usually outsource, like collaborate on the statistical part. We, generate the data, we have someone else analyze the stats. But I'm glad that you're here, you're doing the work, you're reading out the literature. And
Yeah.
so that kind of tells me
Well,
what,
if I may, sorry to
yeah,
cut
sure,
you off,
sure.
but I wish that my nitpicking was getting to the level of, whether or not those studies were truly compatible or the outcomes were really appropriate to be combining in some kind of synthesized effect size. But I just want to give you an example of my favorite thing that I'm working on right now, a meta-analysis that I kind of have my sights on, and they reported a statistically significant pooled effect for this one outcome. And the confidence interval spanned from negative 54 to positive 56. So, I mean, we are talking about a confidence interval that is straddling zero almost perfectly. And they reported that as a statistically significant pooled effect, meaning that it should overlap not at all with zero. So, I mean, when I crunched the numbers, I found that the actual p-value was like zero point 0.9, and they calculated it as somehow below 0.05. So, like,
Well, that
when I
is
talk about
just
meta-analyses in this
mathematically
space,
impossible.
it's as far from true as you could quantitatively get. So when I talk about kind of going through and fixing some of these errors in meta-analysis, I mean, we're talking about really major glaring foundational stuff, and it's a bit so I don't want to be like really pessimistic, but it's a bit sobering where that at least in theory, two reviewers and an editor looked at this paper and they saw a big diamond at the bottom of that forest plot that was squarely straight over
Over
zero,
zero.
like almost symmetrically perfectly over zero. And they said, if you want to call it statistically significant, I'm on board. And
Fine,
so
yeah.
it makes you think, like, between the people who wrote the paper, the people who reviewed it, and the editor who signed off on it, does anyone know what's happening here? Like at a very, very basic kind of fundamental level. Or, to be more charitable, does anyone have the time to actually look over this?
Yeah,
So
especially since it's unpaid work, right? Like I wanted to get to this later, but yeah, like basically, they send you a paper, they ask you to review it, and you're not getting paid for it. And it's funny because the next time you're gonna submit to that journal, it's not like they don't even give you, I don't know, journal credits or something like that because you have to still pay the full price of
yeah.
application if you wanna, which is like a very like it's a cool business model, right? It works for the publishers. It's like, but for the
it
researchers,
If you can live
yeah.
with it, it's a good business model. Yeah, I might be ethically conflicted if I were at the helm, but no, I mean, I have seen some journals that are starting to give some paper credits for reviewing, which is a step in the right direction. But at the end of the day, the economics are still kind of messed up in the sense that, like, some of these journals, it'd be like you'd have to review, man, like probably, I mean, dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of papers in order to actually offset the cost to submit a single paper in the
Wow,
future.
that
So
that's
you're
wow.
really locked into quite a commitment with them.
Like a step in the right direction, but a
Yeah, it's a step
baby
toward the
step
finish
towards the
line.
right direction.
Yeah, a
But yeah,
step toward the
so
finish line, but it is a marathon at that point.
yeah,
So you're one step into about
yeah,
26 miles. Yeah.
maybe in 1 century we'll get there. So yeah, that's the thing. So because of those methodological differences and all of the things that I talked about, you would expect at least for the math to be like it has to be perfect. Like it has to be if you want to draw some solid conclusions out of it, like multiple cohorts like that, you have to at least do your due diligence with the math. So you see more and more of papers like that, but obviously you don't have the time to write about all of them. How did the apple cider vinegar study caught your attention, and why did you decide to write about that one?
You know, I don't remember exactly the first place I saw it, but I write for the Mass Research Review every single month. I review three studies that came out related to exercise, nutrition, body weight regulation, stuff that's kind of within my scientific wheelhouse. So I'm always kind of keeping my eyes open. But this paper, if I had to guess, I probably actually saw it out in the wild. So not digging through journals, but just somebody posting about it online. Because this paper pretty immediately got a lot of traction. It was getting shared a lot on social media. There were a lot of traditional media outlets that were writing stories about it. So it really was kind of all over the place. And, the journal itself played a role in that. I mean, the supplementary file that was posted with the original paper was a
Was a
press release.
press release. Yeah,
Yeah, so they definitely were interested in getting eyes on the paper for sure. Because I don't think that's a normal thing for their journal for every
that I've
paper.
never
I
seen
could be
something like
wrong,
that.
but that would strike me as pretty unusual. But anyway, yeah, it was getting shared a lot, and there you see in my line of work countless papers where it says, oh, this supplement, this food, this drink, whatever causes fat loss. You look into it and it's like, oh, in these mice, it reduced fat mass by 2% or something, just like some kind of trivial thing. And you just kind of move on with your life. But in this case, we're talking about, and you know the data probably better than I do. It's been a while since I looked back into the raw numbers, but we're talking about over I think 12 weeks. We had children that were losing, adolescents that were losing what, like 15 pounds, 12 pounds,
Yeah, like
from simply
nine,
having a
ten
little bit
percent of
of,
their body weight. Yeah.
yeah, just from having a little bit of apple cider vinegar with no change to their diet, with no change to their physical activity. And so, we talked earlier, if there's one thing I specialize in now that I'm working in a doubly labeled water laboratory, it's counting the calories. Where do they go? So we're always looking at what is the composition of a body, what is the expenditure of a body, what is the intake going into that body. All this stuff has to make sense when we crunch the numbers. And I'm sure we'll get into this, but with this particular paper, you looked at this massive reported fat loss. You look at no change in diet, no change in physical activity,
Activity,
a little bit of
no side
vinegar.
effects.
Yeah, a little bit of vinegar coming in. Your first thing you start thinking about if you're kind of wired to look at body weight regulation very quantitatively is where did all these calories go? And there was not a good answer for that.
Yeah. And well, so your interest was from a scientific perspective. So are you telling me there's no, like, this doesn't have any cultural significance for the United States? Like, why on earth is there a show on Netflix called Apple Cider Vinegar? Is that about this study or
No.
no?
So apple cider vinegar, I was reading up on the history of it's not very culturally relevant in America. There's not like a meaningful cultural connection to it in any way, but it has just kind of been this one remedy that's kind of lived in the alternative medicine space that started getting promoted decades and decades ago and has just kind of always been out there as like, hey, maybe I heard some vague thing that this was supposed to help with fat loss or a variety of other things. So there's no real like meaningful cultural connection. It's just one of those remedies that got popularized a long time ago. And as is always the case, once those gain enough traction and become kind of sticky in the collective consciousness, they never really go away, right? They just kind of hang out there as an
Yeah, like
alternative
as a
remedy that
bonus.
you've heard about. Yeah, and its popularity is going to go up and down based on a new celebrity invested in it. A new celebrity has some kind of partnership. A new influencer posted about it online. I think Katy Perry maybe was like I think they actually might have bought a large apple cider vinegar company. And so
Oh,
and she's like a big pop star in America. But yeah, it kind of ebbs and flows in terms of popularity, but there is no major cultural connection to it in a meaningful way.
okay. That's interesting. Because on my side, well, let me tell you about the significance in my culture.
Yeah.
So I have a track record of talking about the ineffectiveness of apple cider vinegar for weight loss and increases in metabolism. And I guess that must have somehow leaked into my search history and browsing history because one day I opened Google News and it's bombarding me with like all these news articles about that study, that particular study. So a little background here. Um, Apple cider vinegar and cider in general, it just has a particular cultural significance in the Middle East and the regions of the world that use the like traditional Persian medicine, Arabic medicine, Islamic medicine, Greek medicine. So these are all basically traditional frameworks of medicine that believe that the body is like composed of four different humors and all of the disease. Or, I don't know. Have you heard of anything about that?
Honestly, I don't know anything about it. So it's really nice for me because like if someone were to say like, "Hey, you're just singling out this study because you have an axe to grind because you don't respect or appreciate this culture," like I literally have no idea. So I'll
Okay,
take
let
your
me.
word for it. Yeah, me, I just like numbers. I like making sure they all fit together.
Okay. So there's this belief that there's this framework of medicine that says, there are these four different humors that the body is made of, and every disease is due to some kind of imbalance between these four different humors. And ciders are believed to fix some of those imbalances, like without getting into a lot of details about it. It's just the alternative medicine type, like kind of belief.
Yeah.
And
Can you clarify one thing for me?
sure.
What is so like as an American who grew up in the Midwest, the only thing I know about cider is apple cider. Um, what exactly is a cider? Like when I hear cider, I think of like a tasty fruit-based alcoholic beverage. So like, is there some alternative like category of ciders, or is that what we're talking about?
Maybe I should have used the word vinegar.
Okay,
Like
okay.
all these different vinegars. Like, yeah, of course, we have grape vinegar, we have date vinegar, we have apple
Okay,
cider vinegar, right?
okay.
And yeah,
That makes
so
sense.
yeah.
Because yeah, when
And
I go out, I like beer. My wife doesn't. I get a beer. She gets a cider. So I'm like, are we participating in some kind of medical
yeah.
intervention here? What are we doing? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you caught that. So, yeah, so that's the basic premise. And some of these imbalances that are believed to cause weight gain are believed to be fixed by vinegars. I should say vinegars. And that's why, so just apple cider vinegar, like vinegars in general, have this cultural significance. And then on the other hand, we have apple that has its significance of its own. It's believed to be like a detox agent. It's like we even have a saying that says if you eat an apple every day, you'll never get sick in your life. So apple cider vinegar becomes this like dual combo of like a very potent, like very popular traditional medicine remedy for all sorts of ailments, like for skin, for hair, for weight loss, for cardiovascular problems, for diabetes. If you want to increase your metabolism, it does it all. And that's why I keep talking about it so much. And like that must have leaked into my browsing history because now Google is showing me that. And I'm clicking on the link and I'm thinking, okay, here we go again. There's another blog about how great apple cider vinegar is. But then I see the word BMJ and I'm like, okay, so this is not one of those run of the mill, like, papers that get published in the alternative medicine sphere of journals. This
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
from a
Yeah. There's
reputable.
there's all these journals that are, the so and so blank blank Journal of Alternative Medicine, and you
Yeah,
look into it, it's not indexed on PubMed. God knows if anybody peer reviewed it. You just pay them $300 and they publish your work, right?
exactly. Yeah, yeah. So this is not one of them, right? So it gets my attention, and I'm here in the middle of it all. As a biomedical researcher, I try to educate my audience about like the modern medicine, scientific medicine, and everything that the traditional alternative medicine gets wrong. And then on a different role as a coach and a trainer, I try to talk about the weight loss myths and the agents that are like advertised to do miracles for your weight loss, but they actually don't work. And apple cider vinegar is like where these two words collide. So that's why I was interested. So I saw the word BMJ, I check it out, and then I see the effect sizes, as you said, because people lost what, like 9%, almost 9-10% weight in some of these groups with what, 2 teaspoons of apple cider vinegar. And that's like, for context, the semaglutide class of drugs that are believed to be a breakthrough, like a revolution in weight loss medicine, they help you lose what, 6-7% body weight during this same duration. So
Yeah.
here we have apple cider vinegar. So what's happening? Helping you lose 10%? Was the big pharma hiding it from us? Like what's happening there? So that's how this paper landed on my desk. So would you mind telling us why big effect sizes like that could be problematic? So do we have a problem with every paper that comes out and has a big effect size, or do we have a beef against apple cider vinegar? What is it?
Well, no, I mean, I love stuff that has large, meaningful effects and is cheap and safe, and yeah, to me, that's the best case scenario. If I could wake up every day and there's a new thing that comes across my desk of an affordable, safe intervention that's highly effective and solves a major problem, that would be a great day every day. But at the end of the day, the goal with research is to figure out what is our best estimate of the true effect of any particular intervention. In this case, when we look at the results of this study compared to comparable studies, which already I'm a little bit skeptical of even some of those effect sizes when you just compare to other interventions of similar nature. But this was just a huge outlier in terms of, there are some studies where, people get a similar amount of apple cider vinegar and maybe they lose half a kilogram or a kilogram over similar time frames. And it's just extremely difficult to explain why all of a sudden we're seeing some kind of finding where, we're seeing like a 600-700% increase in the observed effect, even compared to some of um, the more promising studies on the topic. So it's not that there's a problem with large effect sizes. There's kind of two problems. Number one, large effect sizes that are incompatible with all the work that came before it on the same topic. And then number two, effect sizes that are so large that you cannot actually point to a plausible physiological mechanism, right? So if a thing induces fat loss, we're interacting with a world of laws now, right? We're talking about relationships between mass and energy. So so we don't get to just kind of fudge those numbers and say, yeah, don't worry about it. 7 kilograms of
Disappear.
fat disappeared, right? We have to say, well, if that fat's going away, there's only so many levers we can pull, right? Did this beverage cause extreme malabsorption of dietary nutrients such that these people were essentially not getting calories from their diet? Did it induce tremendous reductions in energy intake by affecting
Suppressing
appetite?
appetite.
Exactly. Or did it cause tremendous increases in energy expenditure such that their body had to actually tap in to stored fat as an energy source? And when you crunch some of the numbers, I mean, those are the only three mechanisms I could think of that would be remotely plausible. And you really can't make any of them work if you actually calculate them out. So, for example, the malabsorption is just completely a non-starter because this paper reported no adverse effects. And believe me, if you had people that were having that level of malabsorption from their diet because of drinking apple cider vinegar,
Oh, They
you
would
would have
know.
had a you would have had a 99% adverse event reporting. I mean, every single person would have reported severe gastrointestinal issues, and they would have left the study. There's no way they would have finished. In this case, they had no adverse effects reported and zero dropouts. So it's just completely not remotely plausible. Um, we crunched the numbers in the letter to the editor that we wrote and said, hey, if this is supposed to be impacting appetite, then somehow only this time, none of the previous times that it's been studied, now apple cider vinegar does what Ozempic does, but stronger. That doesn't seem very, very plausible, especially when we've studied this many times before. And then on the energy expenditure side, we're now to believe that all of a sudden, it's never been observed prior, that apple cider vinegar increases energy expenditure to the same extent as DNP, which is a drug sometimes sold as a supplement, which is a mitochondrial uncoupler. And so what it does is it makes the mitochondrial membrane a little bit more leaky. So without getting like fully into details on the whole like oxidative phosphorylation pathway, what we eventually do in order to create ATP, to create this chemical energy, is we pump these protons across this one side of the membrane, and then they come back through a transport protein, and that is the kind of mechanical machinery that actually generates ATP in the process. But when that membrane becomes leaky, all these protons come flooding back across it, and they're not going through that actual protein that generates, or that transporter that generates the ATP. So the result of that is your body's burning through all the carbohydrate and fat, it's burning through the energy substrates, it's creating heat as a byproduct of metabolism, but it's not actually producing the ATP that your body needs to just stay alive and keep maintaining function of your organs. So when you have all that leaking in the mitochondria because you've taken DNP, your body says, well, now we have to do more metabolism to try to, it's almost like you have to keep the boat afloat. And the bigger the hole is in your boat, the more you have to get a bucket and start moving, right? So your body still has to get enough ATP. It's going to keep doing metabolism. It's just fighting an uphill battle because those protons are leaking back across the membrane. So what ends up happening when people take too large a dose of DNP is they're making so much heat as a byproduct of metabolism. They're not generating enough ATP. Eventually, they get to a point where all that excess heat accumulates, and they essentially have severe health ramifications of hyperthermia. And in extreme cases, they will actually die of hyperthermia in a cool room. So when we talk about altering your physiology at a fundamental level, that's what DNP does. It puts someone in a room that's 68 degrees Fahrenheit and they die of heat.
They
It's
basically
real.
cook from inside out.
Exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
it's an amazingly powerful and scary drug. Like it is terrifying. And every few years you hear about somebody who bought a shady supplement that was DNP and they died because they took too many of the pills. And so basically, again, we're looking at these results and we're saying, so you're telling me that you gave something that works to that level based on prior DNP research, you gave it to a bunch of 12-year-old kids and everybody's fine. And there's no adverse events. Like it's just not plausible.
Yeah, so if someone were to say, all those prior studies, they used like I don't know, a fake apple cider vinegar. They didn't use a real one. We have the real one here. And what you would say to that is, okay, so I'm willing to take your word for it. But if your apple cider vinegar was so powerful that it created this level of weight loss, I would expect to see some of these mechanisms working like either like a suppression in appetite or like an increase in basal metabolic rate, or like, I don't know, maybe you're just not malabsorbing what you're eating. And in all those cases, we would expect to see at least some side effects, right?
Of
So
course.
that,
Yeah.
yeah, because it's just physics. So fat
Yeah, I mean,
is,
it would have literally been like based on those mechanisms I described, either a huge percentage of your participants say, I have had extreme diarrhea since the moment I started this study and I don't want to do it anymore. Or number two, I've had a racing heart rate and I've been sweating nonstop since I started this study and I don't want to do it anymore. Or number three, I can barely get a meal in and I hate it and I haven't had a bowel movement in 4 days because I basically stopped eating. So like it's gonna be diarrhea, extreme heat stress, or constipation, or any of the other things that we tend to observe in extreme weight loss studies like gallstone formation if you're really shedding weight that quickly. So yeah, you can't just ramp up your metabolism to that level or have terrible malabsorption or completely plummet your energy intake and experience nothing in terms of side
Nothing.
effects.
Yeah, I love it. So let's spend a little more time here because I think this is a great place to make this point that hey, fat is made up of carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, right? If an agent, whatever you're using, whether you're losing the fat through activity, you're running, you're cycling, whatever, or you're taking a supplement that claims to increase your metabolism and burns the fat, or if you're making a drug that actually does that, here's what's happening. That fat is getting oxidized. So it's basically through a multi-step process, it's reacting with oxygen, and the end products are going to be water and carbon dioxide. So they have to go somewhere, right? The carbon dioxide, is usually you exhale it out, it enters your blood through like as bicarbonate, and you exhale it out. And the water, you should be either sweating, you should be either from, is it the sweat? Is it the like increasing urination? Is it like some of it again may go out through breathing? And there's energy in those atoms that if you're breaking the fat, you're going to generate heat, and your body temperature it's just physics. Your body temperature has to go up. You have to have extra sweating. You have to have extra like hyperthermia, in often cases like extra urination, increasing urination, and like increasing sweating, increasing even your breathing rate would go up, and your heart rate has to go up. And these are all the things that we're seeing with an agent that actually, with every agent basically, that actually does, if whether it's like the DMP or if it's was it the T3, that
Yeah.
yeah, you're gonna see all of these side effects. And then apple cider vinegar comes along and says, yeah, we're doing all of that. You're not seeing any side effects. So that's the main reason we get suspicious, right? That's
Yeah.
like, it's not just because you're producing this big of a effect size, this big of a weight loss, but it's that you're doing it without any side effect. You're reporting no one had a change in their dietary pattern, in their physical activity levels, no side effects. So that's what doesn't add up in this study. That's what.
Yeah, yeah, and to your point, I mean, we talked earlier at what felt like a tangent, but now is very relevant and practical to our topic here. But in my lab here at Duke, we study energy expenditure, and there's two main ways we measure that. We'll either lay you down on a table if we want to measure your resting metabolic rate, and like you said, this is just fact of how metabolism works. So if we look at how much oxygen and carbon dioxide are in the air and then you breathe it in and breathe it out, and we look at how those levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide change, we can back calculate that to figure out how many calories were burned because of what you were saying about carbon dioxide as a byproduct. When I talk about my doubly labeled water work and how I put these urine samples under our laser, what I'm looking at ultimately is labeled versions of hydrogen and oxygen. And we're trying to see over the course of a week how quickly did oxygen and hydrogen get eliminated from your body because of all those reactions you just talked about. So we label the oxygen and hydrogen with an extra neutron or two so that we can identify it with our laser machine. But at the end of the day, yeah, there's no getting around how metabolism works in this case. And as we've alluded to, that things just weren't really adding up.
Yeah, and I think this is a good. So if someone who is listening to this, if you wanna take something from this, maybe this is a good lesson. Like if you're seeing an advertisement about any supplement or herb that is claimed to increase the metabolism without any of these side effects, and I mean increasing the metabolism to produce meaningful weight loss, not like 1%, 2%. If it's big enough that it's going to help you weight loss, you should see some of these side effects. If you're not seeing that, it's probably not doing that. Do you think we can go as far as saying this is physiologically impossible to boost the metabolism without seeing any of those side effects? Or should we stop at improbable? Could it be in the future? I don't know. Maybe something comes out. Maybe there's a drug discovery or something like
Yeah,
that. That yeah.
I don't know. I mean, a lot of what you described is basically just the body responding to heat, basically, or increased rate of reactions, basically. So I struggle to think of a scenario where it would not hold up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that's with the effect sizes. That's with the side effects. Now let's get in a little into the math. So when I opened that study, the first thing I wanted to check was I was gonna see where are the caloric deficits that have caused this level of weight loss. And I look at the charts. Well, first of all, I'm not finding them because they're not reported. But there's also the odd pattern that I'm seeing with the means and standard deviations of almost every variable. So if the BMI, for example, if it's between 27 and 34, in all four groups, you're gonna see what the average of almost 30 and a standard deviation of almost 3 or 4. And this repeats for every variable. Like the age is said to be between 12 and, if I'm remembering correctly,
25.
25. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the average for every group, all four groups, is like 17, 18 with a standard deviation of 5. So
Right.
basically, what I'm trying to say is one standard deviation around the mean is covering all of the numbers, all of the participants in what, 10, 12, 13 variables, which is just, it feels intuitively wrong because on a normal curve, you would expect, and we're not saying that this should be a normal curve, but for context, on a normal curve, on a normal distribution, you would expect to see maybe 60, 70% of your population between like in that range, one standard deviation around the mean. But
Yeah.
here we have all of them. And yeah, do you mind getting into a little more detail about what's the problem with that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, for some of these variables, you might expect a normal distribution, meaning most of the values cluster around the average. For some of them, you might consider a uniform distribution to be the expectation, meaning we should just see an equal number of all ages, for example, approximately in the study, rather than, assuming that everyone's going to be in the middle of the age range. So, depending on the variable, you might have a different assumption about exactly what the distribution should look like, but there are distributional assumptions that you can make for each variable. And this is, I think, an area where our colleague James Heathers really shined. So James Heathers has been involved in a lot of projects. He's been described as a data sleuth in many cases. So he's been involved with many projects over many years, looking at questionable research that may or may not be unreliable, and basically poking and prodding at the numbers and figuring out how does this actually work? Because like you said, some of the means and standard deviations that we saw in this paper would basically imply that for reasons that don't actually make sense, we must, in order to get that mean and that standard deviation, we must see a ton of people at the bottom of the range, a ton of people at the top of the range, and no one near the average. And in some cases, we're talking about variables where intuitively we would expect the opposite to be true. We would expect most people to be about average, and very few to be very far on these boundaries. So yeah, there was a number of instances, and James did. He used a technique called sample parameter reconstruction via iterative techniques, or SPRITE, and that is a statistical procedure where you basically put in, the mean and standard deviation for a given variable, and essentially you simulate what these distributions would have looked like. And you can create a bunch of different possible distributions that make it work, and then look at the kind of average or most probable distribution of what this data probably looked like. And in our letter to the editor, I think James did a great job making those figures and showing that for a lot of these variables, the implied distribution of the data was very puzzling, very hard to explain, and fundamentally not compatible with the distribution that you would expect if you went out, recruited a bunch of people, and then randomly assigned them to these four groups.
Well, I'm glad that he did that because before that, when I saw these odd distributions, and that's around the time that I contacted you,
Hmm.
and you were at the time, trying to write a mass article about that, and then I'm like, yeah, we should write a letter to the editor, and you agreed to mentor me because you've done it a bunch of times, and I haven't done it. Like I've done it 0 times, and you did a great job in explaining like the legal aspect and the public facing comments and all of that. But one thing that you asked me was, can you mathematically, you said, I agree that it's unintuitive, but can you mathematically show that these distributions are just impossible? And that night, I wrote a Python script. I said it, okay, let's just assign 30 random numbers between 27 and 34 and stop when the mean was 30 and the standard deviation was 4. So I was basically trying to replicate one of those groups, like the BMI
Yeah.
data for one of the groups. So I thought, yeah, this is going to take like 5 minutes. And it didn't. And I let it run overnight. I come back the next morning and it still hasn't found a one distribution that satisfies those conditions. So when we say, I'm telling that to say, when we say this distribution was improbable, we mean really improbable, as in like millions and billions of computer simulations and random allocations still couldn't come up with one single distribution that satisfied those parameters. And yeah, so James helped us with that bit of it and we used the sprite method and
Yeah. Yeah, and if
we,
memory serves, I correct me if I'm wrong. I vaguely remember, because you were initially when we started partnering on this, we were kind of talking past each other, right? Because you were telling me these distributions must be weird. And then I kept telling you, yes, but for the kind of claims that we want to make, they have to be impossible. And I think there was this one time where you gave it a few tries with simulation and you said, I can't reconstruct this. And then I said, well, I did. And I sent you one that instead of using simulation, I did it myself. Remember
that
that in
was,
Excel?
yeah, I do
And
remember that.
and I sent it back to you and you said something along the lines of, yeah, but that's a ridiculous distribution. And I said, yes, but it's possible. And so all of that is to say, we spent a tremendous amount of time, you and me and James, trying to make sure that we were representing this in the most truthful way. And so what we ended up finding, so for example, with BMI and with age, we said, listen, based on the recruitment parameters, it is possible to get some of these distributions, but it is extremely improbable. And when you do get these highly improbable distributions, someone has to explain how they got this way. Because this is not what data look like when you go recruit people based on the parameters that were listed and randomly assign them to groups. So we all had the right intuitive sense that these are weird. But kind of the biggest thing, like you would have done a great job on your own writing up a write up of why this study looked weird, felt weird, and therefore required further statistical scrutiny with the raw data. But I'm really glad that the three of us came together and really put our heads together because I think the way that we ended up reporting it was as nuanced and truthful as it could possibly be. And at the end of the day, we said, listen, these distributions for many of these variables are possible, but how in the world do you explain how they look this way? And that ultimately is where the need for a statistical review comes into play.
Yeah, so I wanted to thank you for your patience, your persistence, and your
I,
mentorship along this process.
I
But
was I was a
it,
pain in. I won't swear.
uh,
I made your life difficult because I kept
but
pushing you and pushing you. Yeah.
no, no, no. We needed a voice like that. But from my perspective, was that okay? So if one distribution like that is improbable, there we have four groups having distributions like that, and not just on one variable, but like 11, 12. I don't remember right now. Was it 13? Like a bunch of variables, more than 10 basically. And that for me is practically impossible. But yeah, you were saying like it is still mathematically and theoretically possible. So anyway, you've done a great job like on two iron culture episodes explaining all of the details, the technical details, what was wrong with the stats. So I'm not gonna get into that here. Still, we can refer people to those pieces of content James has written about it. But instead, could you just tell me, out of all of the problems, all of the issues with this paper, the false statement of data availability, the lack of reporting of the dietary intakes, the means and standard deviations, the effect size, everything, using a t-test instead of a repeated measures method, out of all of them, what do you think was the smoking gun? What do you think was like the biggest issue with this paper? If you were to name one.
I think this probably speaks to people's biases, right? Like which of these do you think is like the biggest issue? I think that ultimately is almost like a reflection of what you value in research. And for me, the most glaring thing, I just can't get away from the extreme effect sizes.
Mhm.
To me, those lacking compatibility with prior literature and lacking plausible mechanisms, to me, that was the initial thing that got me to look at the paper more closely and really interrogate the data. So, yeah, in terms of the things that were available to us, and there's a different thing about the official statistical review that I think is the worst thing. But for what we knew going into the letter to the editor, to me, it was just the magnitude of effect size.
Okay. Well, fast forward, we now have the official review. We have the that you pointed out. We have the journal's retraction notice. It got some press. Did you get a chance to read all of that? And I think there was like a 13, 16 page supplementary material on the retraction notice on the journal. Did you get a
Yes.
chance to? Okay, what do you think about that? Did you see any issues with the retraction notice itself? Because, and we're
Um,
not talking about the author's response here. We're talking about the journal's response and the retraction notice.
the journal's response in terms of like the official notice that they wrote, um, I thought I wasn't surprised by it. I wasn't infuriated by it. It struck me as a suitable but very kind of watered down retraction notice, right? So they basically, and I'm sure that any organization of this size with this amount of assets and wealth is going to sit down with their legal team and say, how do we write this notice? And what are the do's and what are the don'ts? So to me, this struck me as a fairly straightforward but intentionally superficial notice that just said, here is the general gist of why it's being retracted. The authors have agreed to it. Um, and they say it was an honest mistake, and that's fine with us. That's kind of like the vibe I got from it.
Yeah, it was like walking a fine line between acknowledging the problems and, not accepting real responsibility about it, right? It was more like damage control, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, and
Yes.
that's my thing is I never try to infer or assume exactly what people's motives are or things like that. But I think just as a general statement of fact, a journal generally doesn't want to do a lot of finger pointing in these types of notices unless they have to, right? So, if, for example, the researchers did not accept the retraction and said, no, we reject your conclusion, then they probably would have had to write a more pointed letter saying, well, they don't want to retract it, but we insist because blank, blank, and blank. But I think because the authors agreed to the retraction, they had the ability to say, listen, they're on board with this. No need to point any fingers here. They said it's an honest mistake. Let's all move on with our lives.
Yeah, I get it, but there are some discrepancies still. Like I'm reading from the supplementary material. There's a sentence there that says the discrepancies are too large to be marked as rounding errors.
Right. So
But
so
then on the
yeah.
press release, they like without explicitly saying it, it's like they make the reader, I don't know, believe that like
Yeah.
there's some sort of exporting errors and rounding errors that cause all of this. And
Yeah, so they said here I'll quote it. The authors state that the discrepancies were honest mistakes that arose from version mismatches, data rounding, or formatting differences when exporting from statistical software to reporting spreadsheets. However, the authors agree with the decision to retract the work. Here is what is odd to so first of all, by putting version mismatches, that gives them the opportunity to say well, that's why there are errors larger than rounding differences, right? Is because version A of the spreadsheet somehow got lost in the shuffle, and we did the analysis on A instead of B or B instead of C. So version mismatches gives you essentially an open door to say there were multiple versions of the spreadsheets floating around and the wrong one got analyzed or something like that. Um, what's interesting though is, again, I probably shouldn't even like speculate about this, but whatever. It's Friday. It's the end of the week. I have run out of things to care about. Um, Normally, so like, imagine, for example, you're a researcher, right? Imagine that you did a study and someone said, you were subjected to this investigation, and you go, oh my God, we were supposed to run the stats on the version of the spreadsheet that was dated March 3rd, which had all the typos corrected and was triple checked by our lab assistants. We accidentally ran it on the version from a month prior, and that's why all of our stuff is wrong. Um, Imagine, though, that you invested the time, money, effort, and resources into a 12-week randomized controlled trial with what, 40 people per group? Is that right?
30.
30?
Well, yeah.
Yeah, 30, exactly. Yeah. Why would you not just correct it?
Hmm.
Right? You just say, okay, well then, okay, we'll issue a correction. We'll use
Here's the correct
the correct
spreadsheet.
spreadsheet. We'll go through and edit the things. Um, so I don't know. I could maybe these same authors are going to republish this work, which now they're able to do since it's been retracted. Maybe in a few months, we're going to see that they republish it and say, here is the study with the corrected data, and we're just going to start fresh. It's possible that the journal said, we're not even going to take a correction. The issues are too severe and too widespread. But if they never end up publishing it, that would be a highly unusual thing.
Hmm. Yeah, well, all of that is true. And well, by the way, great job on steel manning their argument. And uh, there was this other thing that the editor-in-chief of the journal said in one of the interviews that I read online, and that I want to take some issue with. I'm going to try my best to steel man it. Well, he said that we are one of the reasons that we accepted this was because the authors come from an underrepresented environment, which I love. Like that's great, that's commendable. We always need like more. I'm from Middle East. We need more research, more high quality clinical trials on different backgrounds, different geographical locations.
And
You know,
it's worth mentioning this paper came out of Lebanon.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm doing like osteoarthritis research right now. We basically had to eliminate some of our groups because we don't have enough, I don't know, Native Americans. Like imagine like in a database of 5,000 people. So we always want that because the clinicians are going to need it. The clinicians are going to need that data in order to provide service to different people. But seeking broader geographical representation doesn't mean we have to lower the bar for accepting any paper. It doesn't mean we have to relax the scientific rigor when we're accepting the studies. Well, if the idea is to maybe address the underrepresentations of some areas in clinical research, maybe provide methodological support, maybe provide support in study design, maybe relax some of those application fees for your journals, because when you exchange the currency for the application fee for some of these journals, it's going to be like a price of a house in some of these countries. And you're having these researchers do your work, because you're still sending them your papers to review and you're not paying them, you're not giving them paper credit. And those are the solutions if you want broader
Yeah.
representation. It's not to,
Oh yeah, sorry,
yeah,
I didn't mean to cut you off there. I was just gonna chime in. So specifically, the editor in chief was commenting about one of the things people asked them is, you published this paper, you accepted it as the editor in chief, but this paper did not submit a trial registration. So they did not pre-register their trial. And that apparently, according to the journal, is a necessary prerequisite for getting a paper published in this journal. Um, Here is why I haven't talked about that personally. Number one, I do not care. Period. Uh, I don't. I think it's good practice to pre-register your trials, but there's a lot of great RCTs that aren't pre-registered, and I frankly don't care that much. So when someone like holds his feet to the fire and says, "Why in the world would you publish a study that wasn't pre-registered?" That doesn't really emotionally move me all that much. We had much bigger problems with this study,
yeah.
so I don't really care about that at all. But the other thing that's odd about that, so again, he said they came from the authors come from a scientific environment that is underrepresented in nutrition research. Um, that is fine, but it really doesn't take any resources to pre-register a trial anyway. Pre-registration is free.
Mhm.
There's many ways to do it. There are many free ways to do it. And so to me, that was the really strange thing, is that pre-registration is not a significant time investment. It's a $0 financial investment. So I just frankly don't understand uh, the connection he's making between people in these regions can pre-register their trials and people in these regions cannot. So yeah, my whole take is, if you want to have an initiative that increases visibility of research coming out of underrepresented areas, scientific environments, or in underrepresented study populations, I'm all for it. I think that's terrific, and there's no question that we have major blind spots in terms of who is publishing research in certain areas and who is being enrolled as participants in certain research areas. I'm all good with that. I just don't really, the reason I haven't addressed this in any of my communications, which I've had many about this study, is number one, I don't care that much about the pre-registration or the lack thereof. And number two, I don't understand the connection between what regions of the world have access to registering a study for free on the internet. It doesn't really make any
Yeah,
sense to me.
yeah. There's that, and there's also, when a high-profile journal like that publishes a study like this, and with that reasoning, that might do harm exactly where it intended to do good.
Mm,
And it
yeah.
is not about a single herb anymore. It is like, imagine there are these people that are biased, maybe some segments that are biased towards like this system of medicine. They find this study. They think every scientist, every clinician that was telling them apple cider vinegar can't help you in any meaningful way to lose your weight. They have been all pharma shells and liars and like, I don't know, idiots maybe. And
Yeah.
now their mistrust of the science grows. And the thing is, it validates that alternative system of medicine, and the retraction notice doesn't get to the same people. And it could also be used as ammunition to feed like some of these conspiratorial thinking that, yeah, the big pharma made them pull this study. The big pharma didn't let people know. So yeah, that's why I think we should always value high quality research, no matter where it comes from. So I know you're not interested in maybe this issue, but if you have anything to say about how should the journals stop this from happening ever again, maybe. And I noticing the time, it seems like we're running out of time. So maybe like if you could tell us like what could be made, because now with the AI and with all sorts of these tools, it's easier than ever to maybe I'm not talking about this particular study. If I wanted to make up some numbers without even these red flags that we saw in this study and publish it online, send it to a journal, it is easier than ever. So what do you think the journalists should do? What do you think the readers should do to prevent something like that from happening?
Yeah, I mean, eh, there's a lot that goes into it. I think one of the things that would have made this whole saga quicker, easier, less tedious, less painful is if we just really embraced open data practices in a meaningful way. So, um, the original paper said all of the study data are attached as a supplementary file to this manuscript. So when we saw those means and standard deviations, and we could have, in theory, we should have been able to just download the raw data, run the analyses, and see, how much did it matter that they did t-tests instead of a more appropriate analysis? Why do what do these distributions actually look like? Instead of relying on the summary data, let's actually plot the distributions and see. So this all could have been wrapped up in about a week if we had access to the data that the statistical uh, reviewer people eventually got access to.
Which we
With
tried.
we tried, you emailed multiple times asking the corresponding author for the data, which is the appropriate thing to do in the academic world. Those emails went unanswered to the best of my knowledge. Last time we talked about it, yeah.
Yes.
So, and the reason that matters is if you dig in, I don't know if did you read the statistical report, that big long document? I think it's like 19 pages.
Yeah, I skimmed it. Yeah.
Yeah, so the bombshell, I alluded to this earlier. The thing that to me is the biggest problem with this study is that the statisticians got the data and they said, okay, using the data you provided, let's replicate the values in the tables that you provided based on this data. The main results of the study were presented in Table 3 and in Table 4. In Table 3, if you look at all the means and standard deviations, there are 128 values, and the same thing is true for Table 4. The statisticians, if my memory serves, I believe they reported that they were able to replicate 0 out of 128 values in Table 3, and they were able to replicate 0 out of 128 values in Table 4.
Hmm.
So, what is the biggest problem with this study, in my opinion? It's that none of the results match the data, which is a problem. Like that's at the end of the day, like we can go into all the different wrinkles of this and talk about, all the downstream effects and the cultural relevance and all these other topics. At the end of the day, again, I spend a lot of my day working on research based on the belief that research is important and worth doing. But that cannot be true if we accept the idea that the numbers in the spreadsheet don't have to match the numbers in the table. None of that can be true if we're going to play keep away with the actual data when there are credible concerns about the veracity of the data that's reported. So, if you were to ask me, how do we fix this? I think what we need to do is obviously make data more available. I know I downplayed how, in this particular case, I considered pre-registration to be like the 95th biggest problem. And it was just like, hey, none of the data match the table. None of the data makes sense. Those are my biggest problems. Having said that, alluding to your concerns about how, now that AI is more in the mix in terms of generating data sets if one wished to, or generating papers from those data sets, I think now we have to think more carefully about number one, open data availability. Number two, time-stamped paper trails during the generation of data. And of course, now there are softwares that do that, where every spreadsheet has a kind of time-stamped record of when numbers were entered, when they were manipulated, things of that nature. Probably more openness with regards to documentation of just the paper trail of how data were generated. A growing concern, and again, I don't think it applies to this paper, a growing concern in the future is going to be, can you prove to me that these data were actually collected and not
Hmm.
generated by ChatGPT? And so
Exactly.
we need to have mechanisms in place, which probably will involve uh, a whole kind of building of infrastructure for how that is documented and verified. So pre-registration will be part of that, but also a much more nuanced kind of paper trail of the actual process of generating the original data. So uh, we need to, like I said, have open data. Of course, pre-registration is very helpful. More transparent abilities to essentially audit. How did these original data come to be in the first place? Were they generated over a time frame that makes sense? Yeah, can we get any kind of verifiable proof that this stuff happened in the way it was reported? That stuff's going to become more and more important. I'm not going to pretend to have the perfect system and infrastructure built up in my brain, but those are going to be the kind of problems that we have to solve. And frankly, we're way behind. It's
Yeah.
already a problem in terms of capability and the opportunity to do that type of thing. Again, just to reiterate, I don't think that's what happened here. But that kind of thing is more accessible than ever. And the fact that we're saying, hey, how should we start thinking about managing that means we're way, way, way too late
Way behind. Well,
as a scientific field. Yeah.
well, hopefully, if you're those baby steps are gonna get us there. And I loved it. That was a great conclusion. And thank you for your time. I want to be respectful of your time. Thank you for coming here, chatting about this. And would you mind saying where can people find you and follow your work?
Yeah, for sure. I'm on Instagram. My handle is at Trexler Fitness. Um, my most of my written work that people would want to read is with the Mass Research Review. You can learn more about that at massresearchreview.com. Uh, and Also podcasts. I do two weekly podcasts. One of them is called Iron Culture. The other one is called Front Page Fitness. You can find both of those on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.
Okay, I'll make sure to link them in the descriptions. Well, thanks, Eric.
Yeah, thank you.